The commercial real estate sector is going to get decimated, as too will retail, because people aren't shopping. They're not going to be able to afford to shop because the dollar is going to lose so much value. Going to Walmart will be like going, to Saks Fifth Avenue. People aren't going to be able to afford to go shop there anymore. But to the extent that people do shop, they're buying stuff on Amazon or other, online retailers. They're not going to malls and shopping centers, and all of these places are in tremendous trouble, and so are the banks that loan money to the owners of these properties because they're going to default. So this is a tremendous crisis that's coming. The real estate that will gain the most value will be like farmland, or land where you have natural resources that you can harvest or grow, and maybe land out in the suburbs, as a lot of people are fleeing these crime-infested, overtaxed cities where they no longer have to work because they can work from home. So you could see a dichotomy between real estate in the inner city and real estate out in the country or the suburbs, where more people are going to be fleeing to as opposed to fleeing from. The markets are in kind of the eye of a hurricane here, and I think you're going to see an explosive up move in gold and silver any day. What surprises me is every day that goes by that it doesn't happen. But it will happen, because the way the markets are looking at inflation right now in the Fed, the markets still believe that the Fed will be successful in its inflation fight, and that this big uptick in inflation will in fact end up being transitory. It's just a longer transition than they may have first thought, but the markets still believe that inflation is going to stay around 2% or lower over the next 30 years. And you can see that by looking at yields on 30-year bonds. You can look at the spread between Treasury inflation-protected bonds and regular Treasuries, that the markets still expect low inflation over the next 30 years, despite these massive deficits. And they believe the Fed can continue to print all this money, do all this quantitative easing, that the balance sheet can grow forever, and none of that is ever going to translate into higher inflation. And I think that's pie-in-the-sky nonsense, and I think soon the markets are going to have to come to grips with reality that the Fed is going to lose the inflation fight. It may not even really have the fight. It may just be bluffing, but ultimately not even have the guts to get in the ring with inflation based on the political sacrifices that would be made short-term for the economy and for employment and for the federal budget deficit. Because if the Fed fights inflation, the U.S. government is going to be forced to dramatically cut government spending, including spending on Social Security, Medicare, and things like that. And so to spare politicians from having to make those tough choices, it's likely that the Fed never follows through with this, and we go back to QE, and the Fed starts cutting rates again, even as inflation remains high. But when the markets realize that the inflation is not going away, and even if we have a recession, inflation is not going away, a lot of people think, well, if the Fed doesn't win the fight against inflation, recession will, because the Fed's going to raise rates high enough to cause a recession, and the recession is going to get rid of inflation. It won't. No. The recession is going to make inflation worse, because in the recession, we're going to have less economic output, but we're going to print even more money. But when the markets come to terms with just how high inflation is going to be, there's going to be a rush into gold and silver like you've never seen. Prices are going to crash up, not down. But what you need to do before the herd is get all the gold and silver that you want now, before that happens. I have a company, or I represent a company, Schiff Gold, that I first founded and I still have something to do with. And we've got the best prices on gold and silver. We don't have people trying to talk you into these collectible coins. You'll get the best prices on bullion, gold and silver, and do it while gold is still below 2,000. Because I think the move from 2,000 to 3,000 is going to happen very quickly, and then the move from 3,000 to 5,000 may happen even quicker than the move from 1 to 2, and the move from 5 to 10, that may happen overnight. So you got to get into real money and get out of fiat currencies as quick as you can. There's a window of opportunity. Have no idea how long it's going to remain open, but just assume it slams shut tomorrow and get your gold and silver today. The Russian natural gas, the Russian oil that they are selling, they're getting a hell of a lot more money for it now than they were before the sanctions. COVID just came along and gave them an excuse they were looking for to blame stuff on, which is what they're now doing with Putin, blaming everything on Putin. But inflation was going to continue even if Russia had never invaded the Ukraine. And then they would have to come up with some other excuse to blame all this stuff on. Problem is, I mean, we can't even afford peace, let alone war. We're in no position to finance a war. In fact, we have to borrow money from our enemies in order to fight them, which makes no sense whatsoever. In fact, our enemies not only would have to finance the war, they'd have to supply us with our material in order to fight the war. So we are in no economic position to have a war. And you also have to remember that these imbeciles, they have one agenda, and it's not to help the country. It's to get reelected. So every decision they make is made from a political perspective, a selfish political perspective. So don't expect them to do what's right for the country, because they couldn't care less about doing what's right for the country. What they care about is how do they get reelected. And generally, what you do to get reelected is the opposite of what you would do if you cared about the country. Most Americans, I believe, are really going to get wiped out. I feel particularly bad for the older people, our age or even a little older, that have saved their whole life and they're about to watch their life savings go up in smoke. Inflation is very destructive for older people. If you're younger, in your 20s, 30s, not quite as bad. Yes, you can lose your life savings, but you haven't had a lifetime to save yet. In fact, a lot of young Americans have no savings. They just have debt, and that'll get wiped out. But older people who are living off of a portfolio, or their retirement, a pension, annuities, it's going to be terrible. A lot of people are going to have to be back in the workforce. The retirement dreams are going to end in a nightmare. I want to save as many Americans as I can from having to suffer those type of consequences. You worked hard for your money. I want to make sure that you don't lose the purchasing power, because that's what matters. Not how much money you have, but what you can buy with the money you have. And you're not going to be able to buy much if you keep it in dollars. I've actually been saying a inflationary depression, because it's going to be really high inflation, and it's not just going to be a weak economy, it's going to be an outright collapse. So inflationary depression might be a better term, because people go back and look at the 1930s, and we had a depression, but at least prices went down. And people think, oh, prices going down are bad because prices went down during the Depression. Prices going down was one of the good things during the Depression. It was a bright spot. It alleviated the suffering during the Depression. Imagine how much worse the Depression would be if the cost of living went up instead of down. I mean, people would be even more depressed if their grocery bills and their electric bills were skyrocketing, which is what Americans are going to be in store for when the second Great Depression arrives. The real inflation that everybody experiences is going to get worse. I was saying last year that 2022 was going to be worse than 2021, because I know in 2021, a lot of businesses were absorbing their cost increases and not fully passing them on, or not passing them on at all, because a lot of businesses were also convinced that this was transitory. And so they just waited it out. They said, why should we bother hiking all of our prices when this is just temporary? We'll just take a hit in the short run to our margins. We don't want to risk losing customers to competitors. And so we'll just eat it. But now in 2022, that they realize that they were mistaken, that inflation was not transitory, that it's permanent and going to get worse. Not only are they raising prices to reflect what's happening in 2022, but they're trying to catch up to what they missed in 2021. So now consumers are going to get hit with a double dose of price increases. And so I think that 2022, if accurately measured, is going to be higher inflation than 2021. And I think that would have been the case regardless of Russia invading the Ukraine.